Have you ever noticed how silence can feel louder than a scream? Imagine handing someone the thing you think will break them, your words, your power, your control, and instead of the expected anger, desperation, or tears, they don't react at all. That's what Prescott faced when he handed Valeria the divorce papers, fully expecting noise, emotion, proof that he mattered. But she didn't argue, she didn't beg, she didn't cry. She simply watched him, calm, unreadable, as if the world could end and it wouldn't touch her. That stillness unsettled him in a way no yelling ever could, because silence can hide preparation, calculation, and something far more dangerous, foresight. And weeks later, when he heard the distant hum of a private jet and realized it wasn't his, it belonged to her, he froze. Every assumption he had about control, power, and victory shattered in an instant because the quietest person in the room often wields the loudest power. Have you ever felt silence press against your chest like ice, cold and unyielding, louder than screaming, heavier than anger, especially when it comes from someone you thought you could predict, someone you believed would crumble at the first sign of betrayal? Prescott had built his life on proof that his decisions mattered, proof that he shaped the world around him, proof that every move he made left a mark on everyone else. So when he slid the divorce papers toward Valeria, he expected a storm, pleading, begging, tears, shouting, any sign that he was significant to her. Instead, she remained perfectly still, hands resting lightly on the table, posture precise and unshakable, gaze meeting his eyes without a flicker of fear, hesitation, or doubt. The silence pressed in, heavy, almost physical, and immediately left him unsettled. The air felt wrong. The energy he depended on to validate himself vanished. Adults rarely admit the insecurity this creates, the creeping, gnawing fear that your presence might not matter as much as you believed, that your importance is imagined rather than earned, that you are replaceable without anyone batting an eye. Prescott thought he understood silence. He assumed it meant weakness, compliance, or surrender. He had spent years reading reactions like maps, interpreting every sigh, every tremor, every glance as proof of authority. But Valeria's quiet was none of those things. It was deliberate, strategic, and sharp. It was a statement so powerful it unmoored him, leaving him questioning every assumption he had about control, influence, and worth. Most adults tie their self-esteem to reactions, proof that they've left an impact, caused a ripple, been noticed. Valeria removed herself from that equation entirely. Prescott's confidence faltered. He wanted drama, wanted pain, wanted noise to confirm his importance. And when it didn't come, the absence felt personal, invasive, destabilizing, forcing him to face a truth that lurks in every adult's hidden fears. What if you've been irrelevant all along? Her stillness hinted at foresight, patience, calculation, and control that he didn't recognize. While he thought the divorce was a conclusion, her silence was preparation, a quiet prelude to a power he could not yet see, a strength that didn't need to scream to be felt, a storm gathering behind calm eyes. The most dangerous moments are rarely the climaxes. They are the pauses before them, the unseen strategies, the calm before impact. Prescott, who measured the world by reactions, realized too late that quiet was not emptiness, compliance, or defeat. It was movement, calculation, leverage. And by the time he understood it, he would already be behind. For the first time in years, he felt irrelevant, outmaneuvered, and unprepared. And the terrifying truth began to settle. Underestimating a quiet person is the fastest way to discover that power does not need to announce itself, and the loudest, most dramatic, most confident figure can be the weakest in the room, and he didn't even see it coming. Prescott expected chaos, a scene of pleading, yelling, bargaining, or even panic, the kind of emotional upheaval that proves dominance, confirms importance, and reassures the ego that one mattered. What he got instead was Valeria sitting across from him, calm, composed, and unnervingly still, her hands lightly resting on the mahogany table, her gaze steady, unreadable. No lawyer flanked her, no documents tucked under her arm, no raised voice, no trembling lips, no desperate attempt to salvage what he thought she valued. He had assumed compliance meant surrender, silence meant defeat, and a lack of emotion was proof of weakness. But staring at her quiet face, he felt a creeping unease, a gnawing doubt that he didn't want to acknowledge. Perhaps she was not broken. Perhaps she was not panicking, and perhaps his supposed victory was an illusion. Adults often measure worth through reactions, and Prescott's identity had always been tied to proof that he mattered, that his presence caused fear, desire, or attention. Valeria's silence denied him all that. It forced a question he had never asked himself. Was he ever truly needed? Did she care at all about what he thought or wanted, or was he merely a temporary fixture in her life? Even Tiffany's bright chatter and eager presence couldn't pierce the tension, couldn't validate the power he assumed he held. Every expectation Prescott carried, drama, confrontation, resistance, panic, had been obliterated by her measured stillness, a silence that radiated intention, control, and foresight. That single, almost casual remark about a flight later that day seemed trivial, irrelevant, absurd even, but it carried weight he could not yet grasp, hinting at a life independent of his assumptions. The divorce, which he believed would prove his dominance and leave him untouchable, instead became a mirror reflecting his miscalculation. Her quiet was not apathy, not weakness. It was strategy, deliberate and patient. Each second of her composure amplified his uncertainty, revealing that victory is often an illusion when judged only by surface reactions. In that moment, Prescott realized the harsh truth. The person he had underestimated was already asserting control over the narrative, the momentum, and perhaps even the future, while he still believed himself the winner. Silence, he now felt, could be more threatening than shouting, more powerful than confrontation, and compliance could conceal a depth of calculation impossible to anticipate. By the time he understood the danger of underestimating her, he was off balance, his assumptions shattered, and a faint but relentless dread took root. The quiet across the table was no absence, it was preparation, patience, and leverage, a demonstration that true power doesn't announce itself, it executes, and Prescott had just glimpsed how completely he had misread the woman who had once seemed so ordinary. Prescott leaned back in his leather chair, city lights gleaming across the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, convinced the divorce had left him untouchable, that his wealth, influence, and entourage guaranteed victory. Yet as he recalled Valeria's calm detachment, a subtle unease began to creep in. Because on the surface, everything had gone exactly as he expected. She signed, she left, she appeared to walk away with nothing, but her quiet confidence hinted at something he hadn't accounted for, a silent calculation beyond his reach, and he realized slowly that he had mistaken stillness for submission, compliance for defeat, absence of protest for vulnerability. He glanced at Tiffany, laughing too loudly at a joke, her nails tapping the crystal glass, and felt a flicker of jealousy, not for her youth or beauty, but for the certainty Valeria radiated effortlessly, certainty that his wealth and ego could not manufacture. And he remembered a seemingly innocent comment about a flight, one line that had meant nothing then, but now suggested foresight, access, and strategy he had not anticipated. And he felt a first prick of fear as he understood the terrifying truth. The divorce had not ended their story, it had merely shifted the battlefield. And while he had celebrated what he thought was a final triumph, Valeria had quietly established a position he could not yet see, one already unassailable. While the illusion of dominance he had so carefully crafted, money, connections, influence, was just that, an illusion sustained by his assumptions about weakness. And as he replayed her calm exit, her steady composure, the absence of panic or desperation, he realized for the first time that silence could be more powerful than shouting, that true power could operate invisibly, measured not by reaction, but by patience, foresight, and timing. And while he had counted on her quiet as proof of submission, it was proof of the opposite, that Valeria's stillness was a force, a signal that he had underestimated her completely. And in that moment, in the room that had once symbolized victory, Prescott understood a new and terrifying reality. Being perceived as the winner is not the same as actually winning, and the woman he had believed powerless was already shaping a future in which his empire, his pride, and his control no longer held the sway he once assumed, leaving him to confront the unsettling possibility that his confidence had been the very thing that blinded him to her preparation and strength.
Prescott paced his glass-walled office, the Nevada sun bouncing off the skyline and reflecting on the gold trim of his desk, trying to convince himself that the empire he had built over a decade was unshakable, untouchable, and completely under his control. Yet the blinking emails on his screen, urgent messages from investors, and murmurs from his operations team suggested otherwise, revealing the first terrifying tremor in the foundation he had assumed solid. Because while Valeria had signed the divorce without protest and walked away with nothing, her absence had created a quiet space where unseen forces were already moving, and that space revealed itself when he learned that a mysterious holding company, one he had never heard of, had quietly acquired the northern sector, the final piece of land required for the sovereign skyport expansion. Land he had assumed was insignificant, now central to every projection, every deadline, every promise to investors and engineers. And Prescott realized with rising panic that no amount of wealth, influence, or connections could immediately reclaim it, because the company had no visible owner, no address beyond a Delaware-registered agent, no negotiation points, only their firm refusal to sell. And every call, every favor, every attempt at leverage only reinforced the impossible truth. Someone else had anticipated him. Someone had moved with precision while he celebrated the illusion of victory, and that someone was silent, unseen, and untouchable. He remembered the casual remark Valeria had made days ago, the line about a flight, something she shouldn't know, and it struck him with the sharp clarity of a hammer. Her quiet had never been weakness, never compliance, never surrender. It had been preparation, strategy, foresight, and while he had measured victory in visible, loud gestures, she had been moving invisibly, untethered by rules he assumed applied to her. And as he stared out over the city, the lights no longer sparkling with triumph, but flickering with the threat of exposure, he felt the first real taste of fear, a gnawing, icy dread that deadlines, construction schedules, and investor expectations could all collapse because of one overlooked detail, one quiet, unreadable act of calculation. Each moment magnified the lesson he had ignored for years. Dominance is fragile, control is an illusion, and power often operates in the spaces you cannot see, in actions taken before you realize the game has even begun. And while he had assumed she was powerless because she signed away her claims, that very act freed her to move unseen, to act decisively, to position pieces he had not anticipated. And Prescott, despite his influence and his carefully curated image of authority, understood too late that his empire's first crack had appeared not through incompetence, misfortune, or error, but through the quiet precision of the woman he had underestimated. And as he rubbed his jaw and stared at the blinking cursor on his screen, he knew in the deepest part of his mind that this was only the beginning, that the real threat had already begun, and that everything he had thought secure, the land, the contracts, the empire itself, was suddenly vulnerable, because Valeria had turned silence into power, and he had been blind to it.
Prescott had always believed that maps, contracts, and signatures gave him certainty, that every square mile, every title, every legal document was proof of his control. Yet the discovery of the Northern Sector's acquisition revealed how fragile that certainty truly was, because beyond the land he thought he controlled, there existed another parcel, small and overlooked, that held the key to completing his sovereign skyport expansion, the project that would cement his legacy and satisfy investors. And when he learned it was owned by an unknown entity, wrapped in layers of shell corporations and offshore trusts, he felt a cold panic creep into his chest, realizing that even his wealth, influence, and top lawyers could not immediately reclaim it, and that while Valeria had walked away from the divorce seemingly powerless, her quiet had created a space in which unseen forces could operate, forces that now dictated the terms of his empire, while leaving him scrambling for solutions. He replayed every detail of the divorce, the calm, unreadable expressions, the casual remarks, the lack of protest, and the terrifying pattern became clear. Her silence had been strategic, a deliberate setup that left him exposed, forced to react to moves he hadn't anticipated. And while he had relied on visibility, connections, and intimidation to maintain dominance, she had acted invisibly, leveraging foresight and patience to claim control where he believed he held it. And Prescott felt a gnawing dread as he imagined the chain reaction: investors demanding progress, contractors pausing projects, permits hanging in uncertainty, deadlines slipping, all tied to a piece of land he could not access, could not influence, and could not pressure, while his empire, meticulously built over a decade, showed the first signs of instability. Every call, every attempt to uncover the owner of the land hit dead ends, and for a man whose identity was rooted in control, predictability, and authority, the realization was crushing. He had assumed compliance equaled weakness, silence equaled surrender, and now he understood the cruel irony that the very person he had dismissed had engineered a scenario where his power was undermined without a single overt action, simply by letting him believe he still controlled the game. As Prescott stared at the topographical maps, zoning plans, and legal notices scattered across his desk, the Nevada sun dipping below the skyline cast long shadows across the office, mirroring the shadow growing inside him, the undeniable truth that the empire he had trusted was vulnerable, that the land he had ignored, the land that shouldn't exist, was the linchpin of his failure, and that Valeria, through patience, calculation, and silence, had positioned herself to dictate outcomes from beyond his reach, leaving him to confront the terrifying fact that true control is rarely visible, and that the quietest move, executed with foresight, can overturn what seems unshakable. Because his victory had been an illusion, and the first true power shift in his life was already unfolding. Prescott had spent his life believing dominance could be measured by visibility, that the world responded to the loudest gestures, the flashiest displays, the most ostentatious signs of power. Yet now, as he waited in the grand hall of his gala, the air thick with champagne and polite chatter, a subtle unease crept in, because before he even saw her, before anyone could explain, there was a sound, a vibration, a low hum rising above the music, the clinking of glasses, the laughter of guests, a sound that pricked his instincts and froze him mid-toast, carrying an authority that demanded recognition, a presence beyond his influence. And as he strained to identify it, the low roar of jet engines filled the hall, subtle at first, then unmistakable, familiar yet terrifying, and his chest tightened because he knew that sound, had heard it in his own hangar, yet could not immediately place who could command it now. The hall seemed to shrink, the murmurs of the crowd fading as the engine's rhythm pulsed through the room, until a final, precise thud of landing gear resonated faintly in the distance, a sound that made even his aides pale, because it carried identity, purpose, and inevitability, a signal of someone's calculated arrival before any word was spoken. And Prescott's mind raced, security breaches, sabotage, impossible logistics, but nothing explained the audacity of it, the way timing alone could dominate a room, disrupt the air, and command attention without confrontation. And then it clicked, the realization hitting him with icy clarity. The person he had dismissed as compliant and powerless had arrived not to argue, not to demand, not to be seen, but to assert presence through precision, foresight, and audacity. and the echo of engines had already claimed the narrative, forcing every eye, every thought, every assumption into her orbit before she even stepped into the hall, leaving Prescott scrambling to adjust while she controlled the tempo effortlessly. And he felt an unfamiliar panic as he realized that all his assumptions about dominance, visibility, reaction, display were useless here, because true power had arrived silently, preempting every attempt to measure it, timing her entry so perfectly that the room itself seemed to obey her. And while he had counted on loud gestures and clear reactions to assert authority, she had measured power differently, through preparation, anticipation, and subtlety, using the quiet before the reveal to establish control over the narrative, over perception, and over him. And as the engine's hum faded and a tense silence settled, Prescott understood a terrifying truth. The moment before the reveal is more dangerous than the reveal itself, because it shapes belief, bends expectation, and positions the observer as the one reacting, while the quiet orchestrator moves freely, unseen yet fully in command. And by the time she entered, fully composed, every instinct he had relied upon to maintain power had already failed, and the gala, the room, and his entire sense of control shifted irreversibly under the weight of sound alone.
Prescott had always believed he understood Valeria, that her smiles, silences, and measured gestures were predictable, that she was a partner he could influence, define, and anticipate. But the events of the past weeks, from the quiet signing of the divorce papers to the Northern Sector acquisition, had shattered that certainty. And now, as the hangar doors opened and she appeared, standing tall and unshakable, a calm authority radiating from every movement, he felt the first real tremor of fear, because she was no longer the woman he thought he knew. Her posture was flawless, her gaze sharp, and each step she took exuded confidence, control, and silent triumph, as if every decision he had assumed would bind her had only sharpened her, preparing her for this precise moment. And Prescott's mind raced to reconcile this presence with the wife he had underestimated for years, the one whose seeming compliance during the divorce he had celebrated as proof of his dominance, only now to realize that her calm had been a mask, a deliberate concealment of foresight, strategy, and capability, because she now held the keys he had assumed were his, control of land, influence, and momentum, yet wielded them effortlessly, commanding attention without a word, captivating investors, staff, and bystanders through presence alone. And as she stepped forward, the fading hum of the private jet's engines still echoing faintly, Prescott recognized a terrifying truth. The woman he believed powerless had never been powerless. The wife he assumed dependent had never relied on him, and every assumption he had made about her, about compliance, about weakness, had been wrong. Each instinct in his body screamed to act, to assert dominance, to reclaim control, but the reality was undeniable. She had already taken it, quietly, decisively, and with precision, leaving him reacting to moves he had not foreseen, scrambling while she dictated terms through sheer presence and calculated calm. And as he followed her movement across the hangar, her subtle smile hinting at audacity and mastery, he realized that the divorce, the acquisitions, the silence, all had been a stage on which she had methodically built power while he remained blind, preoccupied with ego and expectation. And now, standing there, framed by the private jet that symbolized her independence, he saw the full magnitude of her transformation. The woman he thought he knew was gone, replaced by someone unstoppable, composed, and in control, someone who had redefined the rules while he still measured power by visibility, reaction, and spectacle. And in that moment, Prescott understood the crushing, irreversible truth. He had underestimated her entirely, and no wealth, no influence, and no display of dominance could change the fact that she had already seized the future, silently, deliberately, and with authority he could neither challenge nor contain. Prescott had long measured Valeria's worth by the visible markers of their life together, her presence at galas, the subtle nods of approval at meetings, the careful compliance he assumed during the divorce.
But he had never considered the invisible layers of her influence, the quiet leverage she had quietly amassed while he assumed the narrative was his to control. And now, as he pieced together the implications of her silence, he uncovered a truth that would shatter everything he thought he knew. She had inherited more than wealth, property, or social influence. She had been entrusted with a legal clause, obscure yet absolute, embedded in the family trust, granting her control over assets, approvals, and decisions Prescott had always assumed beyond her reach. And the weight of this realization hit him like a cold wave, because it meant that every move he celebrated, every deal he orchestrated, every assumption of dominance had been made on shifting ground, manipulated silently by her foresight and patience. And while he had relied on visibility, loud gestures, and predictable reactions to assert authority, she had relied on preparation, timing, and invisible leverage to claim control without ever announcing it. And the implications were staggering. One signature, one decision she could make could halt projects, redirect investments, and even undermine the plans he had spent years constructing, leaving him scrambling in real time to comprehend how much of his empire, his influence, and his carefully curated world had already been shaped by her hand without his awareness. He revisited every detail of the divorce, every unreadable glance, every casual remark, and the terrifying pattern became clear. Her calm had never signaled weakness. Her silence had never been surrender. Every patient action, every calculated delay had been part of a strategy he had failed to recognize. And now the structure he thought secure, his empire, his plans, his control, was vulnerable to the quiet application of her power, a power she had never owed him and which he could not demand, coerce, or predict. The elegance of it enraged him and fascinated him simultaneously, because she had created freedom where he assumed confinement, influence where he assumed dependency, and authority where he assumed compliance. And as he sat in his office, the city lights below reflecting off the glass, he understood the depth of his misjudgment, the magnitude of his hubris, and the frightening reality. She was free, autonomous, and untouchable, wielding power invisibly while he remained blind to its existence, reacting to moves he could not anticipate, and forced to acknowledge that every assumption he had made about value, compliance, and control had been flawed. Because while he measured life by reaction, visibility, and noise, she measured it by foresight, patience, and subtle leverage. And that knowledge alone rendered him powerless, leaving him to confront the crushing truth that the woman he thought he had understood had been shaping outcomes, dictating consequences, and redefining power all along, quietly, deliberately, and entirely on her own terms.
Prescott had always measured victory in tangible, visible ways: signed contracts, investor approvals, and the carefully orchestrated obedience of everyone around him. But now, sitting in his office surrounded by maps, legal papers, and financial projections, a chilling realization began to take shape. The divorce he had assumed would leave him untouchable had instead set the board for a game in which every move he thought he controlled was subject to forces beyond his reach. Because Valeria, through patience, foresight, and unseen strategy, had positioned herself so that a single decision she made could unravel the empire he had built. And suddenly every plan, every assumed advantage, every timeline he had counted on felt precarious, as if one misstep could trigger consequences he could not anticipate. And the source of this vulnerability was as subtle as it was terrifying: the land she controlled, the trust clauses, and the influence she quietly held were now the literal keys to the continuation of his projects, approvals, and financial agreements he had always taken for granted. And as he traced the chain of events from the quiet divorce to the northern sector acquisition to the obscure land parcels that now dictated the pace of his empire, he saw how each element had been orchestrated deliberately, not out of malice, but as a demonstration of strategic patience, a type of power that does not shout, does not demand attention, yet cannot be ignored. and Prescott felt panic rise as he imagined the ripple effects: investors demanding explanations, contractors halting progress, partners reconsidering deals, all consequences tied to decisions he could not compel and approvals he could not force, leaving him scrambling in real time to salvage control, while realizing that the woman he had underestimated had not only survived but had gained the upper hand. Her calm, unreadable demeanor during negotiations now revealed as a demonstration of dominance, forcing him to confront a terrifying truth. His perception of authority had been an illusion, his assumptions about compliance false, and every advantage he counted on vulnerable to her deliberate, quiet actions. And as he leaned back, the city lights flickering against the glass, he understood fully that this was no minor setback, no temporary miscalculation, but a total recalibration of power, because the empire he assumed untouchable was now contingent on decisions beyond his influence, reliant on approvals she could withhold. And while he had equated movement, action, and reaction with strength, she had proven that true authority is measured in patience, foresight, and subtle leverage. And in that moment, the lesson crystallized with brutal clarity. The woman he had married, the one he thought compliant and predictable, had transformed their shared history into a checkmate, turning every assumption he had made against him, leaving him powerless in ways he had never imagined. And as Prescott stared at the maps, land titles, and legal documents before him, he felt the first true taste of helplessness, the realization that the pieces of the game were no longer his to move, and that the checkmate had already been delivered without a single overt challenge, leaving him to confront the terrifying truth that while he had measured life through reaction, visibility, and noise, she had measured it through preparation, timing, and quiet dominance. And in that reality, he had already lost.
Prescott had spent decades believing that influence, intimidation, and wealth could secure his empire, that contracts, connections, and a commanding presence were enough to guarantee outcomes. But now, as the ripple effects of Valeria's silent strategies became undeniable, he found himself teetering on the edge of desperation, because every project he had counted on was stalled, every investor anxious, and every ally questioning loyalty. And the one asset he thought guaranteed control, the land, the approvals, the leverage he assumed he commanded, was firmly in her hands, invisible yet unyielding, leaving him scrambling for tactics that could no longer guarantee results. And as he paced the marble floors of his office, phone calls unanswered, emails ignored, and contractors hesitant to commit, he realized that his ego, the foundation of his authority, had become a liability, clouding judgment and pushing him toward reckless actions. Because the more he attempted to assert control, the more it became clear that his usual tools, pressure, intimidation, persuasion, or favors, were ineffective against someone who had anticipated his every move, someone whose patience, foresight, and quiet leverage transformed inaction into power. And in that clarity came panic, and alongside panic came moral decay. Because the man who had relied on precise, calculated moves now contemplated shortcuts, legal loopholes, and manipulations he had once sworn never to consider, all to reclaim ground he no longer held. And as he contemplated hiring fixers, coercing partners, and pressuring legal teams, he understood the harsh irony. Every desperate act would display weakness rather than regain authority, broadcasting to observers that the head of the empire was unstable. And the contrast between his frenzied state and her composed, confident calm made it unmistakable that she had anticipated this reaction, that the quieter he became publicly, the more leverage she gained. And while he once equated noise and rapid action with strength, he now discovered that his flurry of desperate moves only amplified vulnerability, undermined credibility, and reinforced her dominance, because her patience had created a position from which he could react but never lead. And every miscalculation, every corner cut, every threat issued intensified the reality that she had built a foundation immune to impulsive attempts at control. And as Prescott stared out over the city from his office, the neon lights reflecting in his eyes and the weight of impending failure pressing down, he understood the full magnitude of his moral collapse, the terrifying realization that power without foresight, wealth without strategy, and authority without preparation was meaningless against someone who had mastered the art of quiet dominance. And in that awareness, he recognized an irreversible truth. His empire was slipping, piece by piece, into hands he could no longer reach, and every desperate attempt to reclaim it only confirmed the reality that patience, precision, and unseen leverage always outlast panic, impulsivity, and ego-driven action.
The gala had always been Prescott's stage, a world where wealth, influence, and carefully curated appearances commanded respect. But tonight, the room itself seemed to shift because Valeria entered not as a companion or subordinate, but as a force that quietly recalibrated the hierarchy, her presence alone capturing attention and altering every perception. And Prescott, who had always measured dominance through visibility and reaction, immediately sensed he was no longer directing the narrative, that the careful orchestration of prestige and control he had relied upon for decades was unraveling before his eyes. And as murmurs and curious glances spread among investors, partners, and socialites, he felt a rare sting of humiliation, an ego-shattering awareness that influence could transfer without confrontation, that authority was as much about perception as it was about wealth, and that one quietly strategic person could eclipse the loudest display of status. And as Valeria moved through the crowd, her posture poised, her gaze confident, her subtle gestures commanding attention, Prescott watched helplessly as every nod, every whispered remark, and every deferential glance reinforced her emerging dominance. And while he once assumed that recognition and visibility were the foundation of power, he now understood that they were fragile and that control over perception was far more potent than contracts, land, or connections. And when she addressed the crowd with calm, assured vision, investors leaned in, partners whispered in admiration, and socialites turned attention toward her ideas, leaving Prescott to scramble in vain to reclaim influence, realizing that even his long-held alliances were now subject to the sway of her quiet authority. And as he considered subtle interventions, urgent messages, or attempts to assert control, it became clear that any action taken in haste would broadcast desperation rather than restore dominance, and each moment he hesitated, each glance at her commanding presence, reinforced a brutal truth. He was no longer shaping outcomes, he was reacting, a spectator to a shift he could neither reverse nor negotiate. And the lesson crystallized with unforgiving clarity. While he had long equated influence with action, wealth, and spectacle, Valeria measured it through timing, patience, and the orchestration of attention, turning admiration, trust, and respect toward her effortlessly. And by the end of the evening, the room had witnessed a subtle yet irreversible transfer of authority, one achieved without confrontation, without shouting, and without dramatic display, leaving Prescott to face the undeniable reality that the social, emotional, and perceptual dimensions of power had been mastered by the woman he had underestimated, and that his empire, though vast, could no longer operate on assumptions of obedience or visibility, because she had proven that control is not given, it is quietly claimed, and tonight she had claimed it entirely.
Prescott had always believed his empire was unassailable, that wealth, influence, and carefully cultivated connections were enough to guarantee success. But now, as Valeria's silent maneuvering revealed its full scope, he felt the first real weight of fear, because every project, every deal, every contract he had relied upon now hung on her decisions, on approvals she could withhold, on leverage she wielded silently yet decisively. And the realization struck like lightning. The land he assumed guaranteed logistics, the trust clauses he thought obscure, and the alliances he considered secure were now entirely under her control, leaving him exposed and scrambling for solutions that might never work.
And as he sat surrounded by financial reports, legal documents, and maps, he understood that each call he made, each negotiation attempted, each attempt to assert dominance would fail against someone who had anticipated his every move, whose patience and foresight transformed inaction into power. And the truth was terrifying. Valeria now held the ultimate bargaining chip, a single offer or refusal that could dismantle his empire, erase influence, and render him powerless. And every frantic attempt to force a reaction would only expose his vulnerability, demonstrating panic to investors, partners, and public observers alike. And as he imagined the fallout, contracts canceled, alliances retracted, perception shifting against him, he realized that this was no ordinary setback, no temporary miscalculation, but a decisive moment where his pride, ego, and resources collided with reality. And every tool he had ever relied on to dominate negotiations, threats, bribes, intimidation, was neutralized by her calm authority. Because she had not only acquired power, she had created dependency, turning his empire into a system contingent on her choice, a choice he could neither compel nor predict. And as he leaned back in his chair, the city lights reflecting off the glass and the weight of inevitability pressing down, he grasped a brutal lesson. Wealth, influence, and reputation alone are meaningless when the final decision rests in someone else's hands. And as the silence stretched, the tension of the offer she could make or withhold loomed over him like a gavel ready to fall, leaving Prescott to confront a terrifying truth. His empire, once untouchable, was now a structure contingent entirely on her patience, strategy, and quiet authority. And every second of delay, every rushed calculation, every attempt to manipulate outcomes only reinforced that the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. And while he had long measured strength through visibility, action, and control, she measured it through timing, foresight, and leverage, demonstrating that dominance is not shown through noise, aggression, or threats, but claimed silently, deliberately, and decisively. And in that crushing awareness, Prescott understood that his game had changed entirely, that survival, not victory, had become the only conceivable objective, and that the empire he had assumed belonged to him could now rise or fall at her discretion, a fact that rendered all his previous calculations, strategies, and assertions irrelevant.
Prescott had reached the edge of reason, standing on the brink of desperation, because every plan, every advantage, and every measure of control he had relied upon to maintain dominance had been dismantled by Valeria's foresight, patience, and quiet authority. And now, with pride shattered and ego bruised, he was willing to cross lines he had once considered inviolable, to play the last dirty card in a high-stakes game where the cost of failure was absolute. And as he sat in his office under dim light, reviewing legal loopholes, corporate vulnerabilities, and potential allies who might bend for the right price, he realized that the final moves would be ruthless, calculated, and morally gray, designed to regain even a fraction of power he had lost. And a cold thrill ran through him as he acknowledged the depth of his own moral collapse, because this was not strategy for honor, but for survival, and the empire that had once symbolized ambition and intellect was now fragile, exposed, and at the mercy of his desperation. And each passing moment narrowed the window to act, making every decision urgent, perilous, and potentially catastrophic, not only for him, but for everyone whose loyalty, investment, or trust he had relied upon. And as he made calls to shadowy fixers, offered hidden deals, and explored legal manipulations skirting the edge of criminality, he understood that every attempt to regain dominance also revealed weakness, desperation, and vulnerability. Because while Valeria had relied on patience, subtle influence, and silent control, Prescott now depended on deception, coercion, and morally dubious strategies, each move capable of temporarily destabilizing her plans, but equally capable of exposing him to legal, social, and financial ruin. And as he considered hiring covert agents to disrupt her operations, applying pressure through hidden channels, and leveraging long-held secrets, he realized the cruel irony. In trying to regain authority, he had become the embodiment of the vulnerability he had always feared, a man driven not by skill or foresight, but by panic and ego. And every action he took carried the double burden of potential success and catastrophic exposure, because misjudgment could undo him completely, yet in that tension lay the addictive thrill of risk. And as Prescott leaned over scattered dossiers, contracts, and maps, he understood that this was no longer just a tactical choice, but a psychological turning point, a moral descent, and a last-ditch gamble where he either reclaimed power or accelerated his collapse. And every subtle hesitation, every intercepted message, every decision could determine whether he survived or fell, and the weight of inevitability pressed down. Because the last dirty card, if played correctly, could buy time, create openings, or destabilize her. But if misplayed, it would expose every flaw, weakness, and desperate impulse, leaving him fully exposed to a woman who had long mastered patience, strategy, and quiet dominance. And in that tense, silent room, Prescott confronted the stark reality that in a game measured by foresight, leverage, and timing, recklessness, moral compromise, and panic were as dangerous as any opponent. And tonight, every choice, every manipulation, and every secret weapon would be his final move in a game where the stakes were absolute and failure would be permanent.
Prescott had always believed he was the strategist, the one who controlled outcomes, dictated the pace of every deal, and anticipated every move. But tonight, as he approached the location of what he thought would be a decisive maneuver, he realized, far too late, that every assumption he had made had been anticipated and turned against him, because Valeria had orchestrated a situation where expectation and reality diverged sharply, where confidence he had carried like armor became vulnerability. And as he entered the building, scanning the rooms for familiar faces, cameras, or signs of compliance, the first hints of deception revealed themselves in subtle ways. Doors slightly ajar that should have been closed, lights flickering in a deliberate pattern, footsteps echoing where silence should have prevailed, and the usual signs of order replaced by a deliberate tension that made his stomach tighten, because he understood that every element, from the placement of personnel to the timing of communications, had been designed to provoke misjudgment, luring him into a space where rational decisions would be disastrous in context. And as he moved deeper, Prescott realized this was not merely a physical trap, but a psychological one, targeting his ego, pride, and need for control. Because the more he convinced himself of superiority, the more precisely he walked into the snare, and every step revealed the clever orchestration of forces he had never anticipated, a convergence of legal, financial, and personal leverage all aimed to corner him. And as doors clicked behind him and trusted voices remained silent, he understood the brutal truth. The information he relied upon had been manipulated, curated to mislead, to provoke choices that seemed logical in isolation but catastrophic in reality. And the subtlety of the trap made it all the more dangerous, because Prescott's instincts for assertiveness and prediction now worked against him, turning confidence into overreach, strategy into liability, and perception into deception. And when he finally reached the main room, the scale of the setup became apparent. Evidence, documentation, and recordings arranged not merely to challenge him legally or financially, but to dismantle the persona he had long relied upon to command respect and influence. And with every glance, Prescott recognized the precision of her planning, the foresight that had anticipated his every move, and the gnawing awareness of inevitability sank in, because the trap was systemic, designed to collapse the empire he had built, undermine alliances, and strip away authority in a sequence
he could neither control nor interrupt, and every attempt to react only confirmed that the advantage he assumed was his had been taken, inverted, and weaponized. And as he processed the meticulous evidence of vulnerability, financial dependencies, legal documents, and subtle manipulations, he realized he had been outplayed at every level, that his empire, his credibility, and his confidence had been anticipated and exploited. And in that crushing moment, Prescott understood the harsh truth. Even the most confident and strategic individual could be lured into a trap that seemed familiar and safe, only to discover that the safety was illusion, the control a lie, and the price of misjudgment, total, irreversible collapse.
Prescott had long believed that secrecy, reputation, and controlled narratives could shield him from exposure, that the cracks in his empire and the mistakes he had hidden could never be revealed. But tonight, that illusion shattered completely, because Valeria had anticipated every defensive measure, every evasive strategy, and had prepared evidence so precise, so undeniable, that even his closest allies could not deny its force. And as he entered the room expecting confrontation or negotiation, the screens flickered on, illuminating faces, contracts, and recorded confessions, each frame tightening the pressure on his chest and racing his mind, because the videos captured not only transactions and manipulations, but also patterns of deceit, private conversations, and betrayals he thought private. And the realization hit him like a hammer. There was no escaping the truth, no spinning the story, no deflecting responsibility, because the recordings allowed only one interpretation, cold and undeniable. And as the clips unfolded, showing financial missteps, manipulated partners, and calculated deceptions, Prescott felt the crushing weight of exposure, a sensation he had never experienced despite decades of influence. And every frame revealed a side of himself he had long ignored, a man blinded by ego, driven by greed, and convinced of invincibility. And as he watched the reactions of observers, investors' nods, partners exchanged glances, subtle murmurs, the blow intensified, because his reputation, carefully built over decades, unraveled in real time, leaving him isolated under the unforgiving gaze of truth, unable to manipulate perception or assert dominance. And as he moved toward the screens, hoping to salvage some fragment of narrative, he realized every plan he had counted on to regain control had been anticipated and neutralized. Because Valeria had orchestrated the reveal with surgical precision, demonstrating her mastery of timing, leverage, and strategy. And as the final clips played, confessions, contracts, and private interactions, he confronted a brutal, unavoidable reality. All his threats, manipulations, and noise meant nothing against foresight, patience, and documented evidence. And the man who had once relied on assertiveness, intimidation, and action now understood that authority without leverage, visibility without preparation, and power without strategy could be destroyed in a single moment, captured on screen, witnessed by all who mattered, and immortalized in ways that could not be denied, altered, or ignored. And as the last frame faded, Prescott felt the full force of collapse, realizing that his empire, influence, and carefully curated identity were slipping beyond his control. Because while he had counted on noise and reaction to assert dominance, Valeria had relied on preparation, precision, and undeniable evidence to dismantle it entirely. And in the glow of the screens, under the gaze of witnesses, he faced the ultimate lesson. True collapse is not loud, not dramatic, but methodical, irreversible, and absolute. And the man who once believed himself untouchable now confronted exposure, accountability, and a reality he could neither manipulate nor escape.
After the screens went dark and the truth finished speaking, Prescott's world collapsed, not with noise or drama, but in quiet, methodical ways that left him exposed, isolated, and stripped of everything he once relied upon.
influence, authority, and admiration, because real consequences rarely arrive with spectacle. They arrive with missing calls, silent offices, abandoned assistants, and partners who suddenly disappeared without explanation. And as days stretched into weeks, he found himself signing documents he'd barely read, navigating investigations and procedures that moved without him, indifferent to his panic or pleas. And slowly, the life he had built for decades dissolved around him, leaving only an echo of presence in empty corridors and abandoned boardrooms, and the realization of true vulnerability pressed in. Wealth and reputation had crumbled, influence had evaporated, and the empire he had once controlled now functioned entirely without him, leaving him powerless, irrelevant, and unseen. And the weight of isolation compounded with every ignored call, every unanswered message, and every day without recognition, because his ego, once inflated by attention and control, now had no outlet, and every attempt to assert himself met with silence, patience, and the calm disregard of those who had once deferred to him. While Valeria moved forward quietly, deliberately, and purposefully, expanding, planning, and building in ways that required no spectacle or acknowledgement of the past. And when letters from Prescott arrived, written in tones of regret, nostalgia, and desperation, she left them unopened, not out of malice, but from clarity, knowing that responding would only prolong a chapter that had already ended. And as the final assets of Prescott's failed empire came up for sale, Valeria acquired the last remaining piece, not as revenge, but as closure, transforming what once symbolized his control into something productive and future-focused. And the contrast between their lives became unmistakable. Prescott confined, broken, and haunted by every miscalculation, while Valeria exercised freedom, direction, and confidence without the need for noise or validation. And as the remnants of his influence were dismantled and repurposed, the most devastating consequence revealed itself. The world moved on without him, uninterrupted, indifferent, and perfectly functional. And the quiet absence of disruption, the invisible erosion of relevance, became the final lesson. Because true collapse is not loud, not dramatic, but subtle, comprehensive, and irreversible. And in that silence, Prescott understood that the power he had sought, the control he had wielded, and the status he had built could vanish entirely without fanfare, leaving only reflection, regret, and the enduring reality that the woman he once underestimated had not only survived his betrayal, but had outgrown the need to ever acknowledge him again, demonstrating that the aftermath of misused power is not chaos or revenge, it is the quiet, unassailable closure that cannot be disputed or undone. Valeria had always understood the true power of patience, observation, and deliberate action. And now, after Prescott's empire had collapsed, after the truth had been revealed, and after the quiet aftermath had stripped him of influence and status, she revealed the lesson she had quietly perfected all along. Silence is not emptiness, and inaction is not weakness, because strategy lives in the moments others rush to fill, in the space where patience allows clarity, and in the calculated timing of every move. And as she walked through offices she now controlled, reviewing contracts, confirming deals, and observing operations running smoothly, the satisfaction she felt was not rooted in revenge, but in mastery, because control is not enforced through shouting, threats, or displays of dominance, but through measured authority, foresight, and leveraging opportunities that others cannot perceive. And the irony was complete. The man who had relied on aggression, ego, and noise spent years underestimating the quiet accumulation of power she had cultivated. And while he reacted, schemed, and overreached, she moved silently, consistently, and decisively, building leverage and securing outcomes he could never anticipate. And every small decision she had made months ago, approving partnerships, acquiring assets, and managing transitions, now compounded into results so complete that Prescott's attempts to regain influence were meaningless, because she had anticipated his moves, neutralized his power, and converted his overconfidence into his undoing.
And as she reviewed the final assets of his failed empire, she acquired the remaining piece not as revenge, but as closure, transforming what once symbolized his control into a tool for sustainable growth. And the contrast between their paths could not have been clearer. Prescott confined by regret, irrelevance, and obsession, while Valeria moved forward with independence, calm confidence, and direction, free from noise or validation. And letters from him, full of anger and nostalgia, remained unopened, because responding would only give life to a chapter that had ended, and her focus remained on progress, precision, and long-term planning, demonstrating the lesson that true authority is earned quietly, exercised with patience, and implemented with deliberate timing. And in that moment, the culmination of years of restraint and foresight became undeniable. The most profound victories do not rely on spectacle. The most effective strategies are not reactive, and the deepest control is exercised in silence, through preparation, leverage, and the clarity to act when the moment is perfect. And as she moved forward, confident and unchallenged, Valeria embodied the final truth that had guided her all along. Mastery is not proven by noise, attention, or confrontation, but by outcomes, patience, and the quiet, unassailable ability to shape the world around you without anyone realizing it until it is already done.